Welcome to Let's Talk Micro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I hope you had a great week. You can always find Let's Talk Micro on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher, Pandora, TuneIn Radio, Good Pods. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Let's Talk Micro. As far as social media, I am on Instagram as Let's Talk Micro, no apostrophe, on Twitter as Let's Talk Micro 1, on TikTok as Let's Talk Micro, and on LinkedIn as Luis Plaza. So go ahead and follow Let's Talk Micro on social media. Leave any comments, any feedback, any possible podcast topic suggestions. And if you listen to an episode, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, of course. And if you listen to an episode and you like it, go ahead and leave a review if it's possible on the platform that you're using. For example, Apple Podcasts, you are able to leave a review. I think, Spotify, you can rate them. If you use any other platform, at least, if it lets you rate it or leave a review, go ahead and do so. It is always very helpful for the podcast. And of course, any feedback is always welcome and appreciated. And if you haven't checked out the previous episode, go ahead and do so. It was a conversation with Callum. He's an infectious disease doctor from the UK, the United Kingdom. And he's also the co-host of a podcast that when you spell it and you pronounce it, it says idiots, but it is actually, it is spelled ID:IOTS, which stands for Infectious Disease Insights of Two Specialists. So if you get a chance to check out their podcast, go ahead and do so. I put the link on that episode, so you can go ahead and check it out. Those of you that work in microbiology, you definitely know about infectious disease doctors, right? We get those requests about either holding cultures longer, about specific antibiotics, and we maybe don't see them as often. So it is definitely good to connect with someone and know what happens with the results, right? The results that we, as medical laboratory scientists or biomedical scientists, as they are called in the UK, the results that we put up there. Do you know how the patient is treated? What kind of antimicrobials? What's the choice they use? How do they affect the patient? How do they work? So their podcast, they also talk about the organisms, kind of like I do, but they also provide their infectious disease, physician view and knowledge about treatment options and how do the antimicrobials work. So it's definitely, like I said, it is a great podcast. And just like Let's Talk Micro, their goal is to put information out there and to educate people in a responsible manner. So definitely, I had a great time chatting with Callum. I didn't get a chance to talk to James, which is the other host. But then, they extended an invitation to their podcast, which I accepted. I am looking forward to it. So if you get a chance, go ahead and check out the previous episode. So on today's episode, we are actually stepping aside from clinical microbiology, and we are talking a little bit about marine microbiology. One of the goals of Let's Talk Micro is also to provide information on what can you do in microbiology. Definitely, clinical microbiology is a huge part of what you can do, but there are many other areas with great importance in the work. So for marine microbiology, as far as information, how to get the degree, what do you do? I brought a guest, and her name is Dr. Jeanette Davis, and she's also known as Dr. Ocean. So Dr. Davis is a marine microbiologist. She's an ocean policy advisor, and she's also a published book author. And in this episode, she talks about how do you become a marine microbiologist, as far as education. What do you do with this degree? What kind of work can you perform? So she goes over that, and she also talks about her books and what she hopes to achieve with her books. Overall, it was a great conversation. Definitely, it was great for me to learn more about another side of microbiology, stepping out of my comfort zone of what I know and learning, and at the same time providing that information to you listeners out there. If you are interested in a career in marine microbiology, now you have a little bit more information. So definitely on the show notes, I will put Dr. Davis's website so you can check it out. And a cool fact that I actually didn't talk to her about in the interview, but it was that Dr. Davis was consulted on the Black Panther 2 movie. How cool is that? So definitely let's go ahead and check this episode and learn about marine microbiology. So the listeners out there, you know that I focus heavily in my podcast about clinical microbiology, but I also like to bring the audience, guests and more information about other areas outside of clinical microbiology. This is a huge field. So with me today, I have a special guest. So she is a marine microbiologist, also known as Dr. Ocean. Her name is Dr. Jeanette Davis. Dr. Davis, welcome to Let's Talk Micro.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here and talk about microbes.
Thank you. It's definitely my pleasure. So just for the listeners out there, let's go ahead and start with an introduction.
Sure. So, again, my name is Dr. Jeanette Davis, also known as Dr. Ocean, and I'm a marine microbiologist. So, I always say, what does that mean? That means I study the things in the ocean that you can't see without a microscope. But obviously, as a modern day marine microbiologist, I don't carry around a microscope to study the things in the sea. So, what I actually do is study organisms at the molecular level, like DNA, RNA. I often compare myself to crime scene investigations or CSI. So, similar to a detective going on a crime scene where they hope to find the DNA that a suspect has left behind. I do the same thing in the ocean environment where I collect a water sample and looking at the DNA that was left behind in the ocean. And that's how I identify the organisms that I work with. So, in a nutshell, that's who I am as a marine microbiologist. I also do ocean policy, so I use my knowledge to try to, advise my leadership at my agency as well as members of Congress on the best way of utilizing the ocean and its resources while also preserving and conserving the animals and the ocean overall. And then lastly, I am a children's science book author where I try to make science more accessible for children.
So definitely, you definitely stay busy, and
Yes.
we'll go ahead and talk about the books and more about what you do in a second. So if someone decides to become a marine microbiologist, so as far as your studies, is that like a PhD, or do you get like a PhD in microbiology with a concentration on marine microbiology? How does that work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And to be fair, sometimes I'm called a marine biologist, which I totally accept and embrace. But I started saying more marine microbiology, one, because it's what I do, but to distinguish like kind of the perception around being a marine biologist and only kind of working with the charismatic fauna or whatever of the sea, so to speak. But the way that I got into this field, honestly, I never really thought about being a marine biologist. And it's interesting because I meet a lot of people who say, I wanted to be a marine biologist who are not marine biologists. And for people who are in the field, we kind of stumbled upon it because we love science. And that's essentially what happened to me. I went to undergrad at Hampton University that had a marine science department. I fell in love because I learned to study the ocean is to study a variety of sciences, which I love science. And when I was studying in undergrad, so I got my bachelor's there, I really was interested in medicines at the time because I thought I was going to go, do this degree in science and then go to medical school. Not that I wanted to be a medical doctor, but I just thought, you love science, is what you do. But I was kind of interested in this concept of medicine, and I did this internship where I learned that much of the drugs or medicines that we use, the precursors for those chemicals come from nature, particularly the marine environment. And so I learned about this concept of, obtaining drugs from the sea. And I met a guy who gave this great presentation, later interned with him, and then became his PhD student. And so I specialize in using my knowledge to, look at organisms that produce these interesting compounds that we can use for medicines. But what we know in the field is that most of the time it's not necessarily the organisms, it's the bacteria or the microbes associated with them. So that's kind of how I got into the field. But for those who want to get into this field, you can do general microbiology for sure. As you said in your introduction, you talk about microbiology a lot, but there's, other aspects to it as opposed to just clinical microbiology. So for those who are interested in microbiology and you want to apply it to the marine side, that is totally fine and acceptable. I now use my degree. I no longer really work in drug discovery, but I work more on big picture ocean resources, and I'm able to use my skill set as a microbiologist, and I've applied it to sea turtles, I've applied it to cetaceans, I've applied it to non-native species, right? And so you could have the basic microbiology skills and apply it to other organisms. Because again, microbiologists essentially looks at things at the molecular level, and living things have DNA, RNA, protein. So um, you can do general microbiology and get into marine microbiology, or you could pursue marine microbiology, right? So, or even molecular biology is another way of looking at it that way. So that's how I got into the field. But you're not limited if you pursue a sole degree of microbiology to then apply that to the marine or ocean environment.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. It's definitely microbiology. It's a huge field, and you mentioned the DNA level and molecular. It's definitely a field that's growing so much, and even on my side in clinical micro, it plays a huge part nowadays. So definitely from identification, testing, it's
Yeah.
just
And
it plays a big part.
yes, absolutely.
Okay. So I know that. So those were my questions about. I was going to ask about what led you to pursue studies, and that kind of you answer that. Um, and what a marine microbiologist do besides what you mentioned, is anything else they can work on?
Yeah. So again, as I said before, I've kind of applied the work that I've done to, I'm going to give an example of non-native species, or what we call invasive species in the ocean environment. Well, they can also be in the land environment too, but you know, it's a big ecological problem, these invasive or non-native species. And essentially they are species that are not indigenous to an area, that are introduced. Sometimes they can be introduced through natural disasters like hurricanes, and things get displaced. They can also be introduced through like ballast water, all of these different ways in which things can be introduced into the ocean environment. And if they are able to um, go to an area where they thrive, they can sometimes disrupt the natural ecosystem there. And they can compete with other native species. They can prey on other native species. They could, alter habitat that are important for native species. So there's a lot of things that they can do to alter the environment, which can alter web food dynamics, our actual seafood consumption and depletion to the species that we consume. So essentially, I'm saying this because they often cost billions of dollars each year in damage in the US alone. And so they're a huge problem. And one of the ways that we try to prevent this from happening is actually the way that we try to kind of monitor this or make sure it doesn't happen is actually prevention. And one way of prevention is early detection. And with an eDNA, using techniques like environmental DNA, also called eDNA, going back to that CSI concept where you're able to take a water sample and look at the DNA that's present, even if the organism is not there. That's something that we're now applying to invasive species management, where even though I'm a marine microbiologist, I can take a water sample and say, is a non-native species detected already in the water sample before we can physically see it, before it becomes in abundance and populates that region. So that's just another way you can take the skill set and apply it to not only science, but also have it inform management decisions as well. So, again, invasive species, fisheries management, and obviously, I'm saying all the things that I've done, but That's another one. How many fish are in the sea? You can also look at DNA as a proxy for relative abundance of what's present. So yeah, these are some ways that you can take the basic microbiology and apply it to the ocean. Um, but yeah, also when I think about climate change, which a lot of it has to do with the ocean and atmosphere working together, and the ocean being a sink for carbon and all of these things, like I've been able to work on those issues too, because a lot of the microbes in the ocean generate gases that go into the environment, and some of them take up gases that are in the environment, right? And as a microbiologist, I can help monitor a lot of those things. So microbiology even fits into the larger picture goals and management decisions such as climate change. So there's a range of things that it can be applied to in the ocean environment.
Wow. Yes, definitely. That's yeah. Yeah. You always, it never stops to amaze me how huge this field is and how much it can be done,
Yes.
and you continue learning. And for me, that, like I say, I focus mostly on clinical micro, and as I continue pursuing studies and learning, and basically, like most organisms, they're not even culturable in lab. A fact like that, it's just like there there's so many, so it's mind blowing in a sense, about all these organisms.
Yeah, I think that's also just staying with your point about it's not culturable in the lab. Going back to the CSI concept, that's why scientists are now moving towards what are the other ways that we can detect and identify microbes without seeing them, because we do know that most of the time what we see um, in the environment is not culturable in a laboratory setting, right? The environment is way more creative and brilliant than the human mind, and has ways of creating environments that are just nearly impossible to create in a laboratory setting. Um, so, yeah, within microbiology, a lot of people are moving towards sequencing, right? Like the ability to look at the DNA or the RNA or the protein and look at that coding for an organisms that you can't grow in a lab, to better understand what it is or to manipulate it. So, that's a really great point. And it's nice to see technology advancing where we can capture what's available without ever being able to grow it in a laboratory setting.
Yes. So besides, your work and as in microbiology, so I have seen you're also a published author, right? You have published some books. Can you talk more about that?
Yes, sure. I'm really excited about my books, my children's science books. I, again, grew up loving science, but as a woman of color, I did not see a lot of people in the field who looked like me. And to be perfectly honest, I just didn't see scientists generally. But when I did, they were typically white men in lab coats. And so just having that image, for a lot of people, it seems unobtainable, right? And so what I wanted to create with these children's science books was, one, simply introduce science to young people in a way that is fun and exciting. I love science growing up, but I also had a very narrow understanding of what science was, because we tend to think about science in terms of being in a lab or in objects. And when I was doing my research, in children's literature, there were great books around children for science, but they, centered objects and other things, but they didn't center the people, the actual scientists, right? And so I wanted to create a new image of what it looks like to be a scientist in a very diverse way. But also, I wanted children to identify with the everyday science around them. So if you're a child who likes animals and you go to the zoo, well, you get to be a zoologist, but there are no books that say zoologist, right? And, if you are a child who loves the ocean, then you get to be an oceanographer or a marine biologist, right? And these are concepts that we don't introduce until later on, when we know that young people are like sponges and they soak up a lot of information. Or if you're a child who was like me, loved playing with plants outside, then you get to be a botanist. But I was never told that you could be a botanist, right? And so my children's books give young readers the actual words of science, even though they do these things every day, so they can know how science is all around them. And the first book is called Science is Everywhere and Science is for Everyone. And then, I focus on over 10 different sciences in that book, everything from, zoology, microbiology, obviously, is there. Chemistry, and chemistry is as simple as baking cookies with your parents, right? And so I explain it in that simple way. Or geology, right? The formation of the earth and rocks and things that kids encounter all the time, but don't know that, like, you picking up a rock is a form of geology. Like, this rock has a story on the planet. And so again, the books really seek to explore science in a simplistic way that children can understand, but also in a diverse way where everyone feels welcome. And then my second book exclusively focuses on oceanography. That's called Jada's Journey Under the Sea. And I wanted a narrative where young people can see themselves in the ocean and they don't have to be mermaids to do so. No offense against mermaids. I love how mermaids are used. But I wanted them to have on, a scuba set and explore what's in the ocean, and also talk about ways in which young people can be involved in protecting and preserving the ocean. So yeah, those are my children's books: Science is Everywhere, Science is for Everyone, and Jada's Journey Under the Sea. And there's so much more to come.
Wow, that is amazing. And I like what you say. Yeah, I mean, generally growing up, yeah, there doesn't tend to be a lot of awareness about things that we can do. It tends to be a lot of generals, like in the sense, yeah, a science world doctor or nurse or working in a lab, or even my profession. Like, I like to talk about this in the podcast, that you found about it when you're in college, and sometimes by accident. So it's definitely great that they're learning about this at a young age, especially, and once they start growing up and thinking, okay, this is what I want to do, and it has a name, and find out how to pursue it and how to do it. So definitely thank you for that. And I tell, I'm always a fan of people that they use their knowledge, their position, to promote awareness about their profession. And so thank you for your work, Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
So is there anything else that you want to add?
Um, I guess I would just add that, and I said this before, science is everywhere, science is for everyone. I am a big advocate of um, diversifying the field of science generally. And when I talk about diversity, it's not limited to ethnicity or race or age or gender. It's expertise, it's perspective, it's the traditional way that we pursue science, but it's also the non-traditional ways in which we pursue science. It's, and it's a cultural aspect, it's a social aspect. And so, I'm just a firm believer is that as we move forward to try to solve global crises like climate change, which microbes play a huge role in, um, that it's going to take a lot of people on board, from microbiologists to the social scientists to chemists to climate change scientists to artists who can, help us visualize this work and excite people. It's the people who are able to effectively communicate. It's the people in policy. It's the people at home who vote the right people in place to do the legislation for it. So everyone plays a role in science, whether you're a microbiologist or not. And so I think that would be, my ending statement. Again, science is everywhere, science is for everyone. And I just hope that more people feel comfortable getting involved in science, regardless of what degree you may or may not hold.
That was great. Yes, and I like that. Science is everywhere. Science is for everyone. I think it's still good. And I think, nowadays with a lot of social media, like other people as well, they're definitely using that medium to promote science. So you're finding a lot of information out anywhere from, like you have like PhD students documenting their journeys on social media. So you see them before. We had no idea. I mean, if you
Yes.
didn't do a PhD, you had little understanding of how it was. You think about PhD, you're thinking of some like a cartoon, some scientist, with the robe, the goggles.
Yes.
So it's definitely great to see all
Yes.
this information and learn a lot. Um, do you have do you have a website that you want to tell the audience?
I do. I do have a website. It's drjeanettedavis.com. Um, and it's DrJeanette.com. So that's drjeanettedavis.com. As I mentioned, I'm also known as Dr. Ocean. So you can also follow me on Twitter at Dr. Ocean24 or on Instagram at Dr. underscore Ocean24. Or you can just Google uh, Jeanette Davis or Dr. Ocean. It will come up. So you can follow me there and find out more on my website.
Okay, yes, definitely. And I will go ahead and make sure that I include that on the show notes for the listeners. So when you're listening to this episode, look at the show notes and you can find the website. Well, Dr. Davis, it's been a pleasure and thank you for taking the time to come into Let's Talk Micro.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, my pleasure. And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about marine microbiology. As always, I enjoy bringing this information to you. How cool is that, right? That with your work, you get consulted on such a huge film as Black Panther 2. I mean, you have to admit, that's pretty cool. And you definitely got to learn something about marine microbiology, which is different from clinical microbiology. As always, continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important, right? If you love what you do and you bring that passion, it's not work, right? You do your best, and then the patients will benefit from that. Please go ahead and enjoy the holidays, enjoy your time off with family, spend it with friends, family, take some time off and recharge. This is the last episode of 2022 for Let's Talk Micro, and Let's Talk Micro will return in 2023 in January. So don't worry, you'll continue to get episodes. We're just taking a little break. So definitely, thank you for the support. Thank you for the reviews. Thank you for listening. All of you, you are amazing. So stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.